You know the story. Or at least, you think you do. Johnny Appleseed, the barefoot wanderer with a tin pot on his head, skipping through meadows, planting apple seeds with a smile. A man who loved nature, loved God, loved America. The saint of the frontier. The gentle eccentric who brought orchards to the wilderness. That's the version they teach in elementary schools. The version that fits in picture books and Sunday school lessons. The version where a peculiar but kind-hearted man wandered the American frontier with a sack of seeds and a dream. A man so pure, so simple, so harmless that even children can admire him without questions. A man who represents everything good about American expansion, about manifest destiny, about the pioneer spirit. I remember learning about Johnny Appleseed in 2nd grade. We sang songs about him. We drew pictures of him with his cooking pot hat and his bare feet. Our teacher told us he was a hero, a man who gave freely to others, who asked for nothing in return. She said he slept under the stars and talked to animals and brought life wherever he walked. It was a beautiful story. Simple. Clean. Easy to understand. But frontiers were never gentle places. And men who walked alone through them, sleeping in hollow trees and talking to themselves, were rarely harmless. The American frontier of the early 1800s was not a place for gentle eccentrics. It was not a place where kindness was rewarded or where strange men were welcomed with open arms. It was a brutal, unforgiving landscape where every day was a fight for survival and where death came in 1,000 different forms. So why did we tell the story this way? Why did we take a complicated, troubling man and turn him into a cartoon character? Why did we scrub away all the darkness and leave only the light? I grew up in Ohio, not far from where Johnny Appleseed walked. My grandmother lived in a farmhouse that sat on land that had been in our family since the 1820s. She told stories about Johnny Appleseed that never made it into those children's books. Stories that kept changing depending on who was telling them. Stories that contradicted each other in strange ways. Some people remembered him with gratitude. They said he saved their families, that without his orchards they would have starved or frozen or simply given up and gone back east. They said he was a prophet, a holy man, someone touched by God with a mission to help the suffering pioneers. But others remembered him with something that looked a lot like fear. They said his presence brought bad luck. They said that families who welcomed him into their homes often faced tragedy within the year. They said there was something wrong with his orchards, something that grew in the soil beneath the apple trees, something that whispered in the wind when you walked among them. My grandmother never said which version she believed. She'd tell both stories, sometimes in the same conversation, and when I asked her which one was true, she'd just smile and say that truth on the frontier was always complicated. There were rumors. Whispers in old cemeteries near abandoned orchards. Stories about communities that thrived after he passed through, and others that seemed to wither in ways no one could quite explain. I remember visiting one of those old cemeteries with my grandmother when I was 12. It was overgrown, forgotten, surrounded by ancient apple trees that no one tended anymore. The gravestones were cracked and tilted, many of them marking the deaths of children. My grandmother walked among them slowly, reading the names and dates aloud. She stopped at one grave, a woman who had died in 1832, and she said something I've never forgotten. She said, "Johnny brought life to the land. But something always died after he left." I didn't understand what she meant. Not then. I thought it was just an old woman's superstition, the kind of folk belief that rural communities carried for generations without really knowing why. But the words stuck with me. They bothered me. They made me wonder. Years later, after my grandmother died, I started collecting stories about Johnny Appleseed. Real stories, not the sanitized versions from textbooks. Oral histories from descendants of frontier families. Church records from communities he visited. Letters from settlers who were there, who saw him, who lived through whatever it was he brought with him. And the more I dug, the more I realized that the man we celebrate was only half of who he really was. Maybe less than half. Maybe the real John Chapman, the man who became Johnny Appleseed, was someone we couldn't celebrate at all. Someone too complicated, too troubling, too real for the myth we needed him to be. The real John Chapman walked through a dying frontier. A frontier that was killing people slowly, grinding them down through hunger and disease and isolation and despair. A frontier where communities were collapsing, where families were fleeing back east, where the great American experiment of westward expansion was failing in ways no one wanted to admit. And what he did to save it, what he chose to do, created a legacy far darker and stranger than any children's song could contain. A legacy that was buried, rewritten, sanitized until all that remained was a harmless story about a man who liked apples. This is not the story you were told. This is the story that was hidden. This is the story of a man who tried to save people who were already ghosts. And the price they paid for his salvation. The price we're still paying, in ways we don't even recognize. Because here's the thing about heroes. Here's the thing about the men we build monuments to and name streets after and teach our children to admire. They're never as simple as we want them to be. They're never as clean. And sometimes, when you dig deep enough, you find that the good they did and the harm they caused are so tangled together that you can't separate one from the other. Johnny Appleseed saved the American frontier. That much is true. But how he saved it, and what it cost, and what grew from the seeds he planted, that's a story we've spent 200 years trying to forget. Let's start with the truth about the American frontier in the early 1800s. Not the mythology we've constructed. Not the romance of manifest destiny and pioneer courage. Not the paintings of log cabins in peaceful valleys or the stories of hardy settlers taming a wild but bountiful land. The reality was brutal and unforgiving in ways that are hard to comprehend from our modern perspective. The American frontier was killing people. Not slowly. Not metaphorically. Actually killing them, in large numbers, in horrible ways, day after day after day. The frontier wasn't an adventure. It wasn't an opportunity. For most people who went there, it was slow death in 100 different forms. Settlers arrived with dreams of land and freedom, only to find themselves trapped in a nightmare of isolation and scarcity. They'd been promised a new Eden, a land of milk and honey, a place where hard work would be rewarded with prosperity. What they found instead was a harsh and hostile wilderness that seemed determined to kill them. The winters were merciless. Not the cozy, fireside winters of Christmas cards. Winters that lasted 6 months. Winters where temperatures dropped so low that livestock froze standing in their barns. Winters where families burned their furniture for heat and still woke up to find ice on the inside of their cabin walls. Winters where people died in their sleep from the cold, just stopped breathing and never woke up, and their families couldn't bury them until the spring thaw because the ground was frozen solid. The summers brought disease. Malaria came in waves every autumn, spreading from the swampy lowlands where settlers had cleared forest for farmland. Whole families would be struck down at once, burning with fever, shaking with chills, too weak to tend their crops or care for their animals. Dysentery killed children in days. One day a child would be playing, the next day sick, the day after that dead. Smallpox swept through communities like wildfire, leaving survivors scarred and blinded. Cholera could empty a settlement in a week. There were no doctors. No medicines beyond what you could grow in your garden or buy from traveling peddlers who were often charlatans selling colored water and false hope. No hospitals. No understanding of germ theory or hygiene or how disease actually spread. Just folk remedies passed down through generations, prayers whispered over the sick, and an acceptance that death was always close, always waiting, always ready to claim another victim. Starvation was common. Not the dramatic kind you see in movies, where people drop dead in the streets. But the slow grinding hunger that weakened bodies and broke spirits. The kind of hunger that made children grow up stunted and prone to illness. The kind of hunger that made adults old before their time. Families rationed food so carefully that they weighed every spoonful, calculated every calorie, knew exactly how many days they could survive on what they had stored. Crops failed. All the time. A late frost, an early snow, too much rain, not enough rain, insects, blight, bad seeds, bad soil, bad luck. One bad harvest could doom a family. 2 bad harvests and they'd be eating tree bark and boiling leather to stay alive. 3 bad harvests and they'd either flee back east in shame or die where they stood. The land, though fertile in theory, demanded more than most families could give. It demanded endless labor, dawn to dusk and beyond. It demanded every moment of every day, every ounce of strength, every bit of will. Children worked like adults. Women worked themselves to exhaustion bearing children and raising them and doing all the same labor as men on top of it. Men worked until their bodies gave out, until their backs broke, until they died in the fields they'd spent their lives trying to tame. The average life expectancy on the frontier was somewhere in the 30s. Think about that. Most people didn't live to see their children grow up. Most people died young, worn out, used up, broken by the simple effort of survival. And then there was the violence. Not always the kind you'd expect. Not the Indian raids that filled dime novels and Buffalo Bill shows. Those happened, certainly. The frontier was built on stolen land and native peoples fought back. But most settlers never saw that kind of violence. Most of the violence was quieter. Closer to home. More personal. Men who'd lost everything taking it out on their wives. Domestic violence was so common that it barely warranted comment. Women covered bruises and broken bones and told themselves it was normal, that this was just what marriage was like on the frontier. Children grew up watching their fathers rage and their mothers suffer and learned that this was how the world worked. Neighbors feuding over boundary lines until someone ended up dead. Over a disputed fence post, over a wandering pig, over an insult real or imagined. In the absence of law, in the absence of any real authority, men settled disputes with fists or knives or guns. And the survivors buried the bodies and told themselves it had been justified, it had been necessary, it had been self-defense. The kind of violence that happened behind closed doors and got buried with the bodies. Children who disappeared and were never spoken of again. Women who died in childbirth under circumstances no one wanted to examine too closely. Accidents that weren't quite accidents. Suicides that were probably murders. A constant background hum of death and suffering that everyone accepted because what choice did they have? Death didn't knock on the door out here. Death already lived in the house. Death was a member of the family. Death ate at your table and slept in your bed and followed you into the fields. You learned to live with it because you had to. You learned to accept it because the alternative was madness. This was the world into which John Chapman walked. This was the dying frontier he set out to save. He was born in Massachusetts in 1774, the same year the First Continental Congress met, the same year the American Revolution was beginning to brew. His mother was Elizabeth Simons Chapman. She died when John was young, probably from complications of childbirth. His father, Nathaniel Chapman, fought in the Revolutionary War as a Minuteman. He was at Bunker Hill. He survived, but like so many men who lived through war, he came back changed. Harder. Colder. Less able to connect with his children. John grew up learning that the world was hard and God was harder. He grew up learning that life was suffering and death was certain and the only real question was whether you faced it with dignity or despair. He grew up in a young nation that was still figuring out what it wanted to be, still raw from war, still uncertain about its future. By the time he was in his 20s, he'd become something unusual. An ascetic in a land that demanded pragmatism. A mystic in a world that only valued survival. While other young men were pursuing wealth or women or status, John Chapman was pursuing something else. Something harder to define. He dressed in rags by choice. Not because he was poor, though he had little money. But because he believed that material possessions were a distraction from spiritual truth. He wore a coffee sack with holes cut for his arms and legs. He walked barefoot even in winter, even through snow and ice. He said shoes separated him from the earth, from the natural world God had created. He slept on the ground, in hollow logs, anywhere but a bed. He said comfort made men weak, that the body needed to be disciplined, that suffering brought you closer to God. He ate the simplest food, often just mush made from cornmeal, sometimes nothing at all for days at a time. He said fasting cleared the mind, opened the spirit, allowed you to hear the voice of the divine. People didn't know what to make of him. In a society where everyone was struggling to survive, here was a man who seemed to be struggling to suffer. In a world where everyone wanted more, here was a man who wanted nothing. It was unsettling. Unnatural. Suspicious. He preached from the Swedenborgian Church, a mystical sect founded by Emanuel Swedenborg, a Swedish scientist and theologian who claimed to have had visions of heaven and hell. Swedenborg taught that the physical world was a reflection of the spiritual world, that everything material had a spiritual counterpart, that you could communicate directly with angels and spirits if you learned how. It was strange theology, even by the standards of the time. Most Christian denominations rejected Swedenborgianism as heresy. But John Chapman embraced it completely. He carried Swedenborgian texts with him everywhere, reading passages aloud to anyone who would listen. Most people wouldn't. They'd nod politely and back away, uncomfortable with his intensity, with his certainty, with the wild look in his eyes when he talked about New Jerusalem and the coming transformation of the world. He was called a saint by some. People who were desperate for hope, who needed to believe that someone out there was pure and good and acting from selfless motives. They saw his poverty and his asceticism and his constant preaching as signs of holiness. They said he was touched by God, chosen for a special purpose, walking the path of the truly righteous. He was called a lunatic by others. People who saw his behavior as evidence of madness, who thought he was mentally ill or brain damaged or possessed by demons. They said no sane man would live like that, would suffer like that, would reject every normal human comfort and connection. They said he was dangerous, unpredictable, someone to be avoided. Children were afraid of him. His appearance was frightening. His ragged clothes, his matted hair, his bare feet cracked and bleeding, his strange habit of talking to himself or to people who weren't there. Children would hide when they saw him coming, peeking out from behind their mother's skirts, whispering about the crazy man who lived in the woods. Adults were unsure whether to welcome him or chase him away. He existed in that strange space between holy man and madman, and on the frontier, that line was always thin. Saints and lunatics often looked the same. Both talked about visions and divine missions. Both rejected normal society. Both lived on the margins, neither fully part of the community nor fully separate from it. But John Chapman had a mission. He believed, truly believed with every fiber of his being, that he could save these dying communities. Not through preaching alone, though he tried that. Not through prayer, though he prayed constantly. But through something more practical. Something tangible. Something that would outlast him and continue his work long after he was gone. Orchards. He began planting apple seeds everywhere he went. In clearings near settlements. Along trails that connected one community to another. Near cabins where families were struggling to survive. He'd arrive in a settlement with his sack of seeds, his Swedenborgian books, his wild eyes and wilder preaching. He'd plant his seeds in careful patterns, tend them for a season, show people how to care for them. Then he'd move on. The next community. The next orchard. The next salvation. And for a while, it seemed to work. Orchards grew where he'd been. Apple trees spread across the frontier, hardy and resilient, surviving neglect and harsh weather and the general chaos of pioneer life. Communities that had been on the verge of collapse suddenly had something that would last, something that would produce for decades, something that would feed them for generations. The trees grew tall and strong. The apples grew thick on the branches. The orchards became landmarks, meeting places, sources of pride. People would say, "Johnny planted these trees. Johnny gave us this. Johnny saved us." John Chapman became Johnny Appleseed. The legend grew with the trees. The man who brought life to the wilderness. The saint of the frontier. The eccentric but harmless wanderer who wanted nothing for himself but gave everything to others. It was a beautiful story. It was the story America wanted to tell about itself. About how good men with pure motives could change the world. About how individual acts of kindness could transform a harsh landscape into a garden. About how the frontier wasn't really brutal and deadly, it was just waiting for the right person to come along and unlock its potential. But there were always rumors. Strange ones. Whispered when people thought no one was listening. Shared in the dark after the children were asleep. In some towns where Johnny planted orchards, the orchards thrived but the people didn't. Families that had been struggling before Johnny arrived found themselves struggling in new ways after he left. The crops still failed. The sicknesses still came. The winters were still brutal. But now there was something else. Something harder to define. There were reports of strange silences in those orchards. Of people walking into them and feeling an overwhelming sense of dread, of wrongness, of being watched by something they couldn't see. Of dreams, recurring dreams that everyone in the community seemed to share. Dreams of walking among apple trees at night. Dreams of voices calling from deep in the orchards. Dreams of digging in the soil beneath the trees and finding things buried there. Old things. Wrong things. Some settlers said they felt watched when they worked among Johnny's trees. Not by animals, they knew what that felt like. Not by neighbors, that was different. By something they couldn't name. Something that made the hair stand up on the back of their necks. Something that made them want to leave, quickly, without looking back. And there were deaths. Not dramatic ones. Not ones you could point to and say, this was murder, this was plague, this was an accident with a clear cause. Just a steady background hum of dying that seemed to follow Johnny's path across the frontier. More deaths than you'd expect. Deaths that followed patterns no one wanted to acknowledge. Old women would cross themselves when they saw him coming. They'd make signs against evil, ancient gestures that predated Christianity, folk magic passed down for generations. They'd mutter prayers or curses, depending on their tradition. They'd warn their daughters to stay away from him, to not speak to him, to not accept anything from him. Children would hide, not just because they were afraid of his appearance, but because of something deeper. Some instinct that told them this man was dangerous in ways they didn't understand. Some animal awareness that predators trigger in prey. Men would welcome him with forced smiles and haunted eyes. They needed the orchards. They needed what he brought. But they didn't like having him around. They'd count the days until he left. They'd breathe easier once he was gone. Something was wrong. Something about Johnny Appleseed, about his orchards, about the places he went and the things that happened there. But no one could quite say what. No one could point to a specific crime or a clear cause. It was just a feeling. A suspicion. A fear that maybe the price of salvation was higher than anyone wanted to admit. Here's what they don't teach you in school about Johnny Appleseed. Here's the fact that gets left out of every children's book and every classroom lesson and every statue erected in his honor. Johnny Appleseed's apples weren't for eating. Oh, they looked like eating apples. Red, round, hanging heavy on the branches the way apples should. They looked exactly like the kind of apple you'd pick on a crisp autumn day and bite into with satisfaction. But if you actually tried that, if you actually bit into one of Johnny's apples, you'd understand immediately why settlers didn't harvest them that way. They were bitter. Intensely, aggressively bitter. So sour they'd make your mouth pucker and your eyes water. Hard as stones, even when fully ripe. The flesh was grainy, mealy, unpleasant in texture. Absolutely unpalatable raw. You could force yourself to eat one if you were desperate enough, if you were starving and had no other options. But it wouldn't be pleasant and it wouldn't be nutritious and you'd regret it. These weren't eating apples. They weren't the kind of apples you'd use for pies or preserves or any kind of cooking. They had one purpose and one purpose only. They were cider apples. And that distinction, that single fact, changes everything about the Johnny Appleseed story. It transforms the narrative from a simple tale of a man bringing food to hungry settlers into something far more complicated and far more troubling. See, cider in the early 1800s wasn't the sweet, spiced drink you get at autumn festivals today. Cider wasn't something you served to children or drank once a year as a seasonal treat. Cider was alcohol. Hard cider, specifically. Fermented apple juice with an alcohol content anywhere from 5 to 12%, depending on how long you let it age and how strong you wanted it. Hard cider was the water of the frontier. That's not an exaggeration. That's historical fact. Every family made it. Every community depended on it. It was more common than milk, more reliable than well water, more essential than bread. Why? Because water on the frontier could kill you. Rivers and streams carried diseases. Wells were often contaminated. Settlers didn't understand germ theory, didn't know about bacteria and viruses, but they knew empirically that drinking water made people sick. Made them die, even. So they didn't drink water if they could avoid it. Cider was safer. The fermentation process killed most pathogens. The alcohol content prevented bacterial growth. A barrel of cider could last months without spoiling, could be stored through the winter, could be transported without losing its safety or potability. But it wasn't just about safety. Cider was also currency. In a frontier economy where actual money was scarce, cider was as good as cash. You could trade it for goods, for services, for labor. A barrel of cider was worth more than a bushel of wheat. A good cider orchard made you wealthy by frontier standards. Cider was medicine. The alcohol dulled pain, reduced fever, helped people sleep when injury or illness kept them awake. Doctors, what few there were, prescribed it for everything from toothaches to tuberculosis. It didn't cure anything, obviously, but it made suffering bearable. And cider was comfort. It was the only pleasure, the only relief, the only escape that most frontier families had access to. After a day of backbreaking labor, after losing a child to disease, after failing to make the harvest you needed to survive the winter, you could sit down and drink and forget, temporarily, how hard your life was. Johnny Appleseed knew all of this. He wasn't naive. He wasn't ignorant. He understood exactly what he was planting and exactly what it would be used for. He wasn't bringing orchards for nutrition. He was bringing orchards for oblivion. For the only medicine that worked on the frontier, the only thing that made the pain bearable, the only escape available to people who had no other options. And he made a choice. A deliberate, calculated choice. A choice that would define his legacy and haunt it forever. This is where the story gets complicated. This is where John Chapman stopped being a simple saint and became something much more human and much more troubling. Because what he did next reveals something about the nature of salvation, about the price of survival, about the impossible choices that define us. He saw what was happening to these communities. He saw the suffering, the desperation, the slow death. He saw families giving up, packing their wagons, fleeing back east in shame and defeat. He saw settlements emptying out, cabins abandoned, fields returning to wilderness. He saw the American frontier failing, the great experiment of westward expansion collapsing under the weight of its own brutality. And he made a calculation. A cold, hard, pragmatic calculation. If he planted food orchards, orchards with apples meant for eating, they'd feed people for a season, maybe two. But food orchards required care, required cultivation, required grafting techniques that most settlers didn't know and didn't have time to learn. Food orchards needed constant attention, pruning, pest control, disease management. They were fragile. They failed more often than they succeeded. One bad year and the whole orchard would die and all that work would be wasted. But cider orchards? Cider orchards were nearly indestructible. You could plant the seeds and walk away. Just put them in the ground, give them a little water, and leave. The trees would grow wild, would survive neglect, would thrive in conditions that would kill cultivated fruit trees. They'd produce for decades, for generations, with minimal care. They were hardy, resilient, perfectly adapted to the harsh reality of frontier life. And what they produced, what those bitter inedible apples could be transformed into, would do something food couldn't do. Something medicine couldn't do. Something prayer couldn't do. It would make the pain stop. John Chapman understood something about the frontier that most people didn't want to admit, something that we still don't want to admit 200 years later. These people were already broken. Already dying. Already too far gone to save in any traditional sense. You couldn't fix the isolation. The nearest neighbor might be miles away. You couldn't fix the poverty. There was no money, no economy, no way to earn wealth. You couldn't fix the death. Disease and starvation and violence were built into the structure of frontier life. You couldn't fix the hopelessness. Every day was a struggle and there was no promise it would ever get better. But you could give them something. You could give them relief. You could give them numbness. You could give them a reason to stay one more winter, plant one more crop, survive one more season. You could give them a way to endure the unendurable. You could give them cider. And so he did. Deliberately. Knowingly. Consciously. John Chapman walked across the American frontier planting orchards that he knew, that he intended, would become the lifeblood of frontier communities. Not because they fed people, but because they helped people forget they were starving. He planted salvation in the form of controlled intoxication. He planted survival purchased with addiction. He planted hope that tasted like alcohol and came with a price no one would calculate until it was too late. It worked. Communities that got Johnny's orchard survived longer than communities that didn't. Not because the orchards provided nutrition, though settlers told themselves that. Not because the trees improved the land, though that's what they recorded in their letters and journals. But because the cider those orchards produced gave people a reason to stay, a way to cope, a method of enduring what would otherwise have been unendurable. The mortality rate didn't change much. People still died of disease, of hunger, of accidents, of violence. The winters were still brutal. The work was still endless. The isolation was still crushing. But the abandonment rate dropped. People stayed. They endured. They drank their way through winters that would have broken them otherwise. They drank through the grief of losing children. They drank through the despair of failed harvests. They drank through the isolation and the fear and the constant, grinding misery of frontier existence. Johnny Appleseed saved the American frontier. That's not hyperbole. That's historical reality. The settlements he visited, the communities where he planted orchards, had significantly higher survival rates than comparable settlements without his orchards. The frontier didn't collapse in the 1820s and 30s the way it easily could have. Westward expansion continued. The American project survived. But salvation always has a price. And the price here was steep. Steeper than anyone wanted to acknowledge. Steeper than we've ever really reckoned with. Within a few years of Johnny's orchards maturing, within a few years of those cider apples reaching peak production, patterns emerged. Dark patterns. Troubling patterns. Patterns that people noticed but didn't talk about, not openly, not where others could hear. Alcoholism spread like its own epidemic. Not the social drinking of taverns and festivals. Not the communal drinking of weddings and holidays. But the desperate drinking of isolation. The solitary drinking of despair. The drinking that starts in the morning and doesn't stop until unconsciousness. Men drinking alone in fields, hiding bottles in their plows, too drunk to work effectively but too addicted to stop. Women hiding bottles in root cellars, drinking while their children played, drinking to cope with husbands who came home angry and violent. Old people drinking themselves to death slowly, welcoming oblivion. Young people learning to drink before they learn to read, inheriting addiction like a family trait. It wasn't everyone. It wasn't even most people. But it was enough. Enough that you could see it in every community with mature orchards. Enough that ministers preached about it from their pulpits. Enough that people started connecting Johnny's orchards with the slow collapse of social bonds, the increase in violence, the sense that something was rotting at the heart of their communities. Domestic violence increased. Again, not everywhere. Not in every family. But enough that people noticed. Women with bruises they couldn't explain. Children with broken bones from falling, they said, from accidents, they insisted. Men who'd been kind before the orchards matured turning mean, turning violent, turning into monsters their families feared. There were whispers about murders disguised as accidents. About women who died mysteriously, whose husbands inherited everything. About children who drowned in wells that weren't deep enough to drown in. About men who got into fights and didn't survive, whose killers were never found or never charged. The graveyards filled with women and children whose deaths were marked as accidents, as illnesses, as acts of God. But people whispered. People knew. People saw the pattern even if they couldn't or wouldn't say it out loud. Johnny's orchards were sustaining communities. But they were also destroying them from within. Creating addiction. Enabling violence. Making survival possible while making life unbearable. And there were other patterns too. Stranger ones. Harder to explain or categorize. Communities near Johnny's oldest orchards, orchards that had been growing for 15 or 20 years, reported weird occurrences that didn't fit any rational explanation. People claimed to see figures walking among the trees at twilight. Not Johnny, he'd moved on years ago, was hundreds of miles away or maybe dead by then. But something. Someone. Shadows that moved wrong. Shapes that looked almost human but not quite. Forms that appeared and disappeared when you looked directly at them. Voices calling from deep in the orchards. Voices that sounded like loved ones, like family members, like people you knew. Calling your name. Asking you to come deeper into the orchard. To come see something. To come help. And people who followed those voices often came back changed. Quiet. Distant. Wrong in ways their families couldn't quite articulate. Children disappeared. Not often. Maybe one every few years. But they disappeared near the orchards, always near the orchards. Search parties would organize, would comb through the trees, would call and call. Sometimes they'd find the children days later, miles away, with no memory of how they got there, with no memory of where they'd been, speaking nonsense about trees that walked and apples that whispered secrets. Some were never found at all. Just gone. Vanished. As if the orchards had swallowed them whole. Were these things connected to the orchards? To Johnny? To whatever he'd planted in the ground along with those seeds? Or were they just the normal tragedies of frontier life, the usual horrors that every community faced, coincidentally clustering around places Johnny had been? No one could say for certain. No one wanted to investigate too closely. Because what would you do if you found out the orchards were wrong somehow? They were keeping communities alive. They were the economic foundation of the region. They were too valuable, too necessary, too important to question. So people didn't question. They just whispered. And died. And disappeared. And drank. And survived. And Johnny? Johnny kept walking. Kept planting. Kept moving from community to community, never staying long enough to see what his orchards became. Never staying long enough to count the cost. Never staying long enough to face what he'd done. Did he know? Of course he knew. He wasn't stupid. He wasn't naive. He'd seen enough of the frontier to understand exactly what he was doing. He'd made the calculation consciously. He'd chosen deliberately. Better a people alive and broken than a people dead and sober. That was the trade. That was the choice. That was the math that justified everything. Some historians will tell you this is too harsh a judgment. That John Chapman was simply a man of his time, planting the crops his time demanded. That alcohol was medicine, was necessity, was culture. That blaming him for the consequences is like blaming a doctor for prescribing morphine, for giving patients relief even knowing they might become addicted. But John Chapman wasn't a doctor. He was a mystic. A prophet. A man who believed in divine missions and sacred purposes. A man who preached about spiritual purity and moral righteousness and living in harmony with God's will. He preached one thing and planted another. He preached abstinence and moderation while planting addiction and excess. He preached about New Jerusalem and the perfection of heaven while creating conditions that turned earth into hell for thousands of families. He knew. He knew what those bitter apples would become. He knew what cider was and what it did. He knew the price of the salvation he was selling. And he planted anyway. Because he'd made his choice. Because he believed the end justified the means. Because he thought survival, any kind of survival, was better than extinction. He made his peace with it by never looking back. By never staying to witness the consequences. By convincing himself that he was saving people, that God had given him this mission, that the suffering he enabled was somehow less important than the survival he ensured. John Chapman walked through America planting orchards. And with every seed, with every tree, with every bitter apple that would become cider, he was making a choice. Not just for himself. For thousands of people who would never know his real name, who would never understand what he'd really given them. He was choosing their survival. And their addiction. Their continuation. And their destruction. All tangled together in roots that grew deeper than anyone could see. By the 1830s, Johnny Appleseed had become something more than a man. He'd become a presence. An omen. A story that changed depending on who was telling it and what they needed it to mean. When he appeared at the edge of a settlement, walking out of the forest with his sack of seeds and his strange clothes and his wild eyes, reactions were deeply mixed. Every community had heard stories about him by then. Everyone knew someone who'd met him. The legend had spread faster than the man himself, growing and mutating as it traveled. Some communities welcomed him with genuine gratitude. They'd survived because of his orchards. They had cider to drink, to trade, to use as medicine and currency. They had something valuable, something that made their lives bearable, something that turned their worthless land into productive property. They saw him as their salvation, as a prophet sent by God, as the one man who'd cared enough to help them when everyone else had abandoned them to die. They'd prepare feasts for him, though he rarely ate much. They'd offer him beds, though he'd sleep on the floor or outside under the stars. They'd ask him to preach, and he would, rambling sermons about angels and spiritual worlds and the coming transformation of all things. They'd listen politely even when they didn't understand. They'd nod and say amen even when his theology made no sense. Because they owed him. Because he'd saved them. Because rejecting him felt like rejecting the only gift they'd ever been given. Other communities wanted him gone. They'd survived, yes, but at what cost? They'd buried too many people. They'd seen too many families destroyed by drink. They'd watched their children grow up in homes where violence was constant, where addiction was normal, where hope had curdled into despair. They looked at Johnny Appleseed and saw not salvation but damnation. Not a prophet but a curse. Not a gift but a poison that took years to kill you. They'd ask him to leave, politely at first, then with increasing urgency. Some threatened him. Some threw stones. Some made it clear that if he didn't go voluntarily, he'd be driven out by force. But everyone noticed the same pattern. It didn't matter if they welcomed him or rejected him. It didn't matter if they celebrated his arrival or feared it. The pattern was always there, unavoidable, impossible to ignore once you knew to look for it. When Johnny arrived, when he planted his seeds and spoke his sermons and moved on, something in the community shifted. Not immediately. Not obviously. But within a year, within 2 years, someone would die. Someone important. Someone loved. Someone whose death felt like more than just bad luck or God's will or the normal cruelty of frontier life. A community leader would have a heart attack in his prime. A beloved mother would die in childbirth that should have been routine. A child who everyone adored would fall ill with a fever that seemed to come from nowhere and couldn't be cured. An elder who'd survived everything the frontier could throw at them would simply stop waking up one morning, dying in their sleep for no reason anyone could determine. It was never violent. Never suspicious. Always natural causes, always accidents, always the usual tragedies that frontier life was filled with. But it happened often enough, consistently enough, that people started connecting it to Johnny's visits. Started seeing him not as a saint but as a harbinger. Not as salvation but as something that brought death in its wake. There's a letter from 1835, preserved in a historical society in Indiana. It was written by a minister named Reverend Thomas Hadley, a Methodist circuit rider who traveled among frontier communities. He describes Johnny's arrival in his town in the spring of that year. The orchards planted, the usual sermon about New Jerusalem and divine love and the perfection of the spiritual world. The minister writes that he found Johnny strange but essentially harmless, eccentric but well-meaning, clearly mad but probably not dangerous. And then, 3 months later, the minister's wife died in childbirth. She'd had 3 children before without complications. She was young, healthy, strong. There was no reason to expect tragedy. But she died anyway, and the baby with her. The minister wrote a second letter a month after that. His handwriting is shakier. His theology more uncertain. He writes, "I wonder now if we invited death when we invited that strange man into our midst. I wonder if there is something in his orchards, something that grows beneath the trees, something that feeds on what we give it. I wonder if my wife paid the price for our community's survival." He left that community shortly after. Gave up his ministry. Was never heard from again. His letters remained in the church archives, unread for decades, until a historian found them in the 1930s and didn't know what to make of them. Another account, this one from Ohio, describes how a community begged Johnny not to leave. They believed his presence protected them. They believed that as long as he stayed, they'd be safe, that his holiness would shield them from the usual tragedies of frontier life. They offered him land, a house, money, anything he wanted if he'd just stay. But Johnny never stayed. He never could. His mission required movement, required spreading seeds as far as possible, required touching as many communities as he could reach. He'd tend the orchards for a season, sometimes 2, and then he'd disappear into the wilderness, chasing his next divine inspiration, following whatever voices only he could hear. The community that begged him to stay? 6 families left within 2 years. Packed their wagons and fled back east, abandoning land they'd spent decades clearing. They wouldn't say why exactly. Just that they couldn't stay anymore. That something was wrong. That the orchards felt wrong and the town felt wrong and staying would kill them. The rest of the community died of fever that next winter. A particularly bad winter, people said. A particularly virulent disease. Just bad luck. Just the frontier being the frontier. But the survivors noticed that the fever seemed to hit hardest in families that spent the most time in the orchards, in homes closest to Johnny's trees. They noticed but they didn't say anything. What would be the point? Was it cause and effect? Or just the brutal randomness of frontier life? Was Johnny bringing death with him, or were people just noticing deaths more when they could blame someone for them? No one could say for certain. No one wanted to say for certain. Because if Johnny was cursed, if his orchards were wrong somehow, then what did that say about all the communities that depended on them? The stories piled up. The pattern repeated. Johnny arrived, Johnny planted, Johnny left. And something died. Someone died. Always someone important. Always someone loved. Always in ways that seemed natural but felt wrong. By the 1840s, Johnny Appleseed had become a figure of folklore. A wandering spirit. A ghost story told to frighten children. A legend that people invoked to explain the inexplicable. John Chapman died in 1845, probably from pneumonia, in a cabin near Fort Wayne, Indiana. He was 70 years old. He'd spent nearly 50 years walking the frontier, planting orchards, preaching sermons, living like a wandering prophet in a land that barely believed in prophets anymore. He died as he'd lived, alone, clutching his Swedenborgian texts, mumbling about angels and salvation and the spiritual world that existed just beyond the veil of the physical. The man who owned the cabin where he died said Johnny's last words were something about apple trees, about orchards that would grow forever, about seeds that would outlive empires. His death should have ended the story. Should have closed the book on Johnny Appleseed and allowed him to fade into history like most frontier eccentrics did. But it didn't. The story didn't end. If anything, it got stranger. Reports started coming in almost immediately. Settlers claimed to see him walking through orchards he'd planted decades ago. Not a ghost exactly, they'd insist. Not something transparent or glowing or obviously supernatural. But something. A figure in rags, barefoot even in snow, carrying a sack over his shoulder. A man who looked exactly like Johnny had looked in life. Always at twilight. Always at the edges of vision. Always disappearing when you looked directly at him. But there. Undeniably there. Real enough that dozens of people who'd never met each other and lived in different states, described seeing the exact same thing. A farmer in Ohio swore he heard Johnny's voice coming from an abandoned orchard one evening in 1846, a year after Johnny died. He said the voice was preaching the same sermons Johnny used to preach, the same rambling theology about spiritual correspondences and New Jerusalem. The farmer grabbed his gun and went to investigate, thinking maybe someone was playing a trick, maybe someone was impersonating the dead man for reasons he couldn't imagine. But when he got to the orchard, there was no one there. Just apple trees and silence. And a feeling, the farmer said, that he was being watched by something that didn't want to be seen. He left quickly and never went back to that orchard again. Let the apples rot on the ground. Sold the land at a loss and moved his family east. Children in Indiana told stories about an old man who lived in the orchards, who would emerge at dusk and offer them apples. They described his appearance perfectly, his ragged clothes and bare feet and strange gentle manner. They said he was nice, that he told them stories, that he gave them apples to take home. But when parents checked, when they went to investigate these encounters, the orchards were always empty. No sign of anyone living there. No evidence of visitors. And the apples their children carried home were always bitter, always inedible raw, always perfect for cider. Parents started keeping their children away from the orchards. Started telling them that the old man in the orchard wasn't real, was a trick of the light, was their imagination. But the children insisted. They'd seen him. They'd talked to him. They knew. These stories persisted for decades. Into the 1860s, the 1870s, even the 1880s. Long after anyone who'd actually known John Chapman had died, people were still seeing him. Still hearing him. Still finding new apple trees growing in places no one remembered planting, appearing overnight in patterns that matched Johnny's style, bearing the same bitter fruit that had sustained and destroyed so many communities. Folklorists today would call this a wandering revenant. A spirit tied to its mission, unable to rest, continuing the work it started in life even after death. Every culture has these stories. Ghosts that don't know they're dead. Spirits that can't let go. Entities that persist because their purpose was so strong, so all-consuming, that not even death could end it. But the settlers didn't have that language. Didn't have that framework. They just knew that Johnny Appleseed hadn't really left. That something of him remained. That the man might be dead but the presence, the mission, the thing he'd brought to the frontier, was still active, still working, still planting orchards and collecting whatever payment orchards demanded. And then something changed. Slowly at first, then all at once. By the late 1800s, America started rewriting its own history. The frontier was closing. Frederick Jackson Turner would declare it officially closed in 1893, saying that the continuous line of frontier settlement no longer existed. The wilderness was being tamed. The rough edges of pioneer life were being smoothed over into something respectable. Something civilized. Something that could be celebrated rather than endured. And as America changed, so did its stories. The brutal reality of frontier life became uncomfortable. The death and violence and suffering became embarrassing. America wanted to see itself as exceptional, as a nation built on noble principles and heroic individuals. It didn't want to remember the reality of westward expansion, the cost in human life and human suffering, the bodies buried in unmarked graves, the communities that failed, the people who died screaming in the wilderness. So it invented a new history. A cleaner history. A history where pioneers were brave and noble. Where settlement was inevitable and righteous. Where America's growth was a story of triumph rather than tragedy. And John Chapman became Johnny Appleseed, folk hero. The alcoholism was forgotten. The addiction that crippled entire communities was erased from the record. The domestic violence, the deaths, the strange occurrences in the orchards, all of it was scrubbed away, deemed inappropriate for the new national mythology. What remained was a children's story. A gentle man who loved nature and brought orchards to the wilderness. A holy fool, harmless and helpful. A man who wanted nothing for himself but gave everything to others. A symbol of American generosity, American ingenuity, American goodness. The historical societies embraced him. The very institutions that should have preserved the truth decided the truth was too ugly, too complicated, too disturbing. They curated the legend instead, selecting the details that fit the narrative they wanted and discarding everything else. Schools taught about him using picture books and songs. Children learned to admire Johnny Appleseed without ever knowing who he really was, what he really did, what his orchards really cost. He became a mascot for westward expansion, for agricultural education, for environmental awareness. Statues were erected. Parks were named. Festivals were held in his honor. Johnny Appleseed became American mythology. Clean. Simple. Comfortable. Safe for children. It was a lie. A comprehensive, systematic lie. A lie built on forgetting, on selective memory, on the deliberate choice to celebrate a sanitized version of history rather than grapple with the complicated, troubling reality. Because the truth was too complicated. The truth was that John Chapman saved a dying frontier by giving it the one medicine that worked, by planting orchards that would sustain communities through alcohol and numbness and forgetting. The truth was that his salvation came with a body count that no one wanted to tally, with social destruction that no one wanted to acknowledge, with consequences that echoed through generations. The truth was that heroes are rarely just heroes. That every great man who changed history made choices that haunt us. That salvation and destruction often grow from the same seed, tangled together so completely that you can't separate one from the other. America needed Johnny Appleseed to be simple. To be good. To be the kind of myth you could teach to children without having to explain the complicated, messy, tragic reality underneath. So America made him that way. Took a complex, troubling figure and reduced him to a cartoon. Took a man who made impossible choices in impossible circumstances and turned him into a mascot. And maybe that's its own kind of tragedy. Maybe the real crime isn't what John Chapman did, but how we remember it. How we erased the real man, with all his complexity and guilt and impossible choices, in favor of a man who never existed. How we deemed his actual legacy too dark for remembering, too complicated for teaching, too real for celebrating. We built monuments to Johnny Appleseed while burying the truth about John Chapman. We sing songs about him while forgetting the songs his communities sang while they drank themselves to death. We tell his story to children while hiding the stories of the children who disappeared in his orchards. We made him a hero by forgetting everything that made him human. I went looking for Johnny's orchards a few years ago. The old ones. The ones planted in the early 1800s by John Chapman himself. The ones that started it all. Most are gone, of course. Swallowed by suburbs and strip malls and interstate highways. The land that used to be frontier is now firmly part of modern America. The wilderness has been completely tamed, paved over, built upon. Most people living in Ohio or Indiana or Pennsylvania have no idea they're walking over land where Johnny Appleseed once walked, where his orchards once grew, where communities once lived and died and made impossible choices just to survive one more winter. But some of the old orchards remain. Hidden in forgotten corners. In state parks that preserved them accidentally while protecting other things. In old cemeteries where the trees were planted as memorials and nobody ever cut them down. In ravines and valleys too steep to develop, too remote to be worth clearing. I found one in eastern Ohio, near a town that barely exists anymore. Most of the population left decades ago when the steel mills closed. What remains is a handful of old people, a gas station, a church that only holds services once a month. And an orchard. An ancient orchard of gnarled apple trees that have been growing wild for nearly 200 years. The local historical society confirmed that Johnny Appleseed had passed through this area in 1823. Had stayed for a season, planted orchards, moved on. This was one of his, they were certain. The only one in the county that had survived into the modern era. They were strange places, those old orchards. Unsettling in ways I found hard to articulate. The trees were massive, far larger than apple trees should grow. Twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out in patterns that didn't make sense. Growing too close together in some places, as if they were crowding each other deliberately. Too far apart in others, as if they were avoiding something in the soil. The light under those trees was wrong. Even on bright sunny days, the orchard was dim. The shadows were too deep. The air was still, quiet in a way that felt unnatural. No birds singing. No insects buzzing. No wind moving through the leaves. Just silence. Heavy, oppressive silence. I walked through that orchard for about 20 minutes. Took photographs. Made notes. Tried to understand what I was seeing, what I was feeling. There was a presence there. I'm not a superstitious person, I don't believe in ghosts or spirits or supernatural phenomena. But there was something in that orchard. Something watching. Something waiting. Something that made every instinct I had scream at me to leave. The apples were still growing. Still bitter. I picked one, bit into it out of curiosity, immediately spit it out. Inedible. Exactly as the historical accounts described. Perfect for cider and nothing else. There were apples rotting on the ground, layers of them, years of fallen fruit creating a thick mulch beneath the trees. No animals ate them. No insects touched them. They just rotted, slowly, releasing a smell that was sweet and sour at the same time, organic but wrong somehow. I asked the people at the Historical Society if anyone ever harvested the apples. They looked at me oddly and said no. Said that people knew better. Said that even people who'd never heard the stories, who didn't know about Johnny Appleseed or the dark history of these orchards, wouldn't touch those apples. They'd walk into the orchard and something would tell them to leave the apples alone. To let them rot. To not disturb whatever was growing there. I talked to an old man who'd grown up near that orchard in the 1940s. He was 93 years old, living in a nursing home, but his memory was sharp. He remembered the orchard. Remembered stories his grandfather told him. His grandfather said that Johnny's trees had roots that went deeper than they should. That if you dug down far enough, you'd find things buried there. Old things. Things that predated the trees. Things that maybe the trees were feeding on, or protecting, or hiding. I asked him what kind of things. He shook his head, smiled a sad smile. Said his grandfather never told him. Just said some stories are better left unfinished. Some questions are better left unasked. Some things that grow in the dark should stay in the dark. I asked if he'd ever dug around the trees, ever investigated. He laughed, a dry laugh that turned into a cough. Said he'd tried once, when he was young and stupid and didn't believe in much of anything. Said he'd taken a shovel into the orchard one night, picked a tree at random, started digging. He got about 3 feet down before he hit something. Something that wasn't soil, wasn't rock. Something that felt wrong under his shovel. He couldn't see what it was in the dark. Couldn't tell if it was wood or bone or something else. But when he touched it, when his shovel scraped against it, he heard something. A sound from deep in the earth. Not a voice exactly. Not words. Just a sound. A response. He filled in the hole and ran. Never went back. Never spoke about it for 60 years. Only told me because he figured he was dying anyway and it didn't matter anymore who knew. There's a cemetery in Indiana, not far from where John Chapman died. I visited it last year. It's old, overgrown, mostly forgotten. The gravestones are cracked and tilted, many of them illegible after 170 years of weather. The cemetery sits on a hill overlooking a valley that used to be farmland but is now mostly forest again. And every year, without fail, apple trees sprout up among the graves. Small trees, saplings, growing in the spaces between gravestones. No one plants them. No one tends them. They just appear, growing from seeds that no one can account for. The locals cut them down every spring. Part of cemetery maintenance, they say. Keep the place looking respectable. But the trees always grow back. Same locations. Same patterns. As if something is planting them deliberately, as if something wants those trees there regardless of what the living want. I talked to the cemetery caretaker, a man in his 50s who'd held the job for 20 years. He said it's always bothered him. Said he's cut down the same tree in the same spot between 2 graves 5 times now. Cut it to the ground, poured salt on the stump, dug up the roots. Doesn't matter. Next spring there's a new tree growing in the exact same spot. He said sometimes, when he's working in the cemetery at dusk, he sees someone walking among the graves. An old man in old-fashioned clothes. Barefoot. Carrying a sack. The caretaker called out to him once, asked if he needed help finding a specific grave. The figure didn't respond. Didn't acknowledge him. Just kept walking, moving between the gravestones, occasionally stopping to touch a tree, to examine an apple, to do whatever it was doing. The caretaker followed him, calling out, getting concerned that maybe this was a homeless person who needed help. But when he got close, when he was maybe 20 feet away, the figure vanished. Didn't walk behind a tree. Didn't fade away. Just stopped existing between one moment and the next. He doesn't talk about it much. People think he's crazy when he does. But he's seen it half a dozen times now. Always at dusk. Always the same figure. Always moving among the graves and the trees like it's looking for something, like it has work to do, like death was just an interruption in a mission that can never truly end. These are the stories I've collected. These are the fragments that remain of something larger, something that we tried to forget but that refuses to be forgotten. These are the pieces of truth that persist despite our best efforts to bury them. Johnny Appleseed, the real Johnny Appleseed, was a man who tried to save a frontier that was already dying. He succeeded, in his way. The communities survived. The settlements grew. The wilderness was tamed. America spread westward just like it intended to, just like manifest destiny promised it would. But the cost was never counted. Or maybe it was, and we just decided not to write it down. Maybe we decided that some prices are too high to acknowledge, that some choices are too complicated to judge, that some men are easier to celebrate than to understand. John Chapman walked alone through a dying world and tried to give it life. What he gave instead was survival, purchased with numbness and watered with alcohol and paid for with a kind of slow poison that took generations to fully manifest. He gave communities a way to endure the unendurable, to survive the unsurvivable, to cling to life in a land that seemed determined to kill them. And it worked. But it cost them pieces of themselves. Their health. Their families. Their children. Their souls, maybe, if you believe in such things. It cost them in ways they couldn't calculate at the time, in ways we're still discovering now, 200 years later, in the patterns of addiction and violence and trauma that echo through generations. Was he a hero? Was he a villain? Was he a saint or a curse or just a complicated man making impossible choices in an impossible situation? The answer is probably yes. To all of it. Simultaneously. Contradictorily. Impossibly. Because that's what real history is like. Real history is complicated. Real history is full of people who did both great good and great harm, often at the same time, often with the same actions. Real history doesn't give us clear heroes and villains. It gives us humans, struggling humans, making choices with incomplete information and limited options, trying to do what they think is right and often causing harm in the process. Every frontier has its saviors. And almost all of them cost more than they promised. The question is whether we're brave enough to remember that. Whether we're willing to look at our heroes and see the full truth of what they did, the good and the bad, the salvation and the destruction, all growing from the same seed, all tangled together in roots that go deeper than we want to dig. Johnny Appleseed planted orchards across America. And what grew from them was never just apples. It was survival and addiction, hope and despair, life and death, all mixed together in ways that can't be separated. It was communities that lasted and families that broke. It was America itself, built on impossible choices and unsustainable solutions, growing strong while rotting from within. Those orchards are still out there. Still growing. Still bearing bitter fruit that no one eats but everyone depends on. Still whispering secrets in the wind. Still holding whatever is buried in the soil beneath their roots. And somewhere, in the twilight of abandoned orchards and overgrown cemeteries, some people swear they still see him. A man in rags with a tin pot on his head. Walking. Always walking. Barefoot even in snow. Carrying his sack of seeds. Still planting. Still preaching. Still trying to save a frontier that died 200 years ago. Still making the same choice he always made. Still paying the same price. Still growing the same bitter apples that no one wants to eat but everyone needs to survive. That's the real legend of Johnny Appleseed. Not the children's story. Not the comfortable myth we teach in schools and celebrate in festivals. But the truth that grows in the dark spaces between the trees, in the silence of old orchards, in the complicated legacy of a man who saved people by helping them destroy themselves more slowly. Every legend has a shadow. Every hero has a cost. And every choice, no matter how well-intentioned, has consequences that echo forward through time, growing and changing and taking on lives of their own. John Chapman planted apple seeds. But what grew was so much more than fruit. What grew was America itself, with all its contradictions, all its compromises, all its impossible choices that look like salvation until you count the bodies buried in the roots. We remember him as Johnny Appleseed because we need heroes. Because we need to believe that individuals can change the world for the better. Because we need simple stories in a complicated world. But maybe it's time to remember John Chapman instead. The real man. The complicated man. The man who made terrible choices for understandable reasons. The man who saved people knowing the price they'd pay. The man who walked through darkness carrying seeds that would grow into both salvation and damnation. Maybe it's time to tell the real story. Not to tear down a legend, but to understand what legends are built on. To see clearly what our heroes did, what it cost, and what we're still paying for. Because those orchards are still growing. Those apples are still bitter. And somewhere in the twilight, that strange man is still walking, still planting, still offering a choice between slow death and slower destruction. Still asking the same question he asked 200 years ago. Still waiting to see what we'll choose. END